historians argue death would have been a mercy. What makes this particularly chilling is that these women had committed no crime themselves. Their only transgression was being bound by marriage to men who had failed to meet Sparta's impossible standards of martial perfection. Yet in a society where collective punishment was seen as natural justice, individual innocence meant nothing. The wife of a coward was contaminated by association, her very presence a reminder of military failure that Sparta could not tolerate. The psychological warfare began immediately. Neighbors who once greeted these women warmly now crossed the street to avoid them. Friends disappeared. Family members distanced themselves, fearing that association with the tainted would spread the contagion of dishonor to their own households. This wasn't casual social awkwardness. It was mandated ostracism, enforced by both law and custom. Historical accounts from writers like Xenophon and Plutarch paint a picture of systematic dehumanization that would make even hardened soldiers weep. These women were stripped of their status as citizens' wives and relegated to a liminal existence, neither fully alive nor mercifully dead. They occupied a social purgatory from which there was no escape, no redemption, and no hope of return to their former lives. The cruelty was deliberate, calculated to send a message that echoed through every Spartan household. Failure on the battlefield would destroy not just you, but everyone you loved. It was a form of social control so effective that warriors would choose certain death over the possibility of subjecting their families to such a fate. The Spartans had discovered something more powerful than the fear of death, the fear of a life not worth living. The Spartan system of punishment for the wives of defeated warriors wasn't born from chaos or emotional reaction. It was a carefully constructed mechanism of social control that had been refined over centuries. To understand the full horror of what these women endured, we must first examine the society that created such elaborate cruelties. Sparta in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE was unlike any other Greek city-state, a place where the normal rules of civilization had been inverted in service of military supremacy. From birth, every Spartan was evaluated through the lens of warfare. Male infants deemed too weak were left on Mount Tegetos to die. Those who survived faced the agoge, a brutal training system that transformed boys into killing machines. But what many forget is that Spartan women, too, were products of this militaristic ideology. They were raised to be mothers of warriors, trained in athletics to produce strong offspring, and indoctrinated with the belief that their primary purpose was to support the military state. This context makes the treatment of defeated warriors' wives even more tragic. These women had done everything their society asked of them. They had borne sons for the army, maintained households while their husbands campaigned, and upheld the Spartan values of strength and endurance. Yet all of this counted for nothing the moment their husbands failed in battle. The same society that had shaped them into paragons of Spartan womanhood now turned on them with savage efficiency. The legal framework surrounding these punishments was as sophisticated as it was cruel. Spartan law, largely unwritten but universally understood, contained specific provisions for dealing with the families of cowards and deserters. These weren't vague social customs, but codified practices that magistrates and citizens were obligated to enforce. The ephors, Sparta's 5 annually elected administrators, oversaw the implementation of these punishments with bureaucratic precision. The classification system was particularly insidious. Not all military failures were treated equally. A warrior who died fighting, but whose unit was defeated, might bring moderate shame to his family. A man who fled from battle brought severe disgrace. But the worst fate was reserved for those who surrendered, the survivors of defeats like that at Sphacteria in 425 BCE, where 120 Spartan hoplites laid down their arms rather than die fighting. Their wives faced the harshest treatment of all. Archaeological evidence from Spartan sites reveals physical manifestations of this social hierarchy of shame. Grave goods, housing arrangements, and even pottery shards suggest that the wives of defeated warriors were systematically excluded from communal spaces and religious ceremonies. They were buried in separate areas, away from honored dead. Their homes, if they were allowed to keep them, bore markers of shame that announced their status to all who passed. The economic implications were devastating. In Sparta's unique system, where land was theoretically held in common but practically controlled by citizens, the wives of defeated warriors often lost access to their kleros, the land allotments that provided their livelihood. Without land, without status, and without the ability to remarry honorably, these women faced not just social death but potential physical starvation. Some were reduced to begging, others to forms of labor considered beneath free Spartan women. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that would haunt any civilized observer. During religious festivals, when all of Sparta gathered to honor the gods, the wives of defeated warriors were either banned entirely or forced to attend in shameful garb that marked them as pariahs. They couldn't participate in the sacred dances, couldn't make offerings at the temples, couldn't even stand among the other women. They existed in the shadows, visible reminders of what happened to those who failed the state. The public humiliation of defeated warriors' wives in Sparta was not random or spontaneous. It followed carefully orchestrated rituals designed to maximize psychological trauma while serving as cautionary spectacles for the entire community. These ceremonies of shame were as much a part of Spartan religious and civic life as their famous military parades, and they were conducted with the same meticulous attention to detail that the Spartans brought to warfare. The first ritual often occurred within hours of the news arriving in Sparta. The wife would be summoned before the ephors or local magistrates, not to receive condolences, but to be formally stripped of her status. This wasn't a private affair conducted with any dignity. It was deliberately public, often held in the agora where the maximum number of citizens could witness. The woman would stand before the authorities while the charges against her husband were read aloud, each word another nail in the coffin of her social existence. What followed was a grotesque parody of mourning customs. In most Greek societies, widows were afforded specific rites and rituals to grieve their dead. They could keen and wail, tear their clothes, and cut their hair in demonstrations of sorrow. But in Sparta, the wives of cowards were forbidden these most basic human expressions. To mourn a coward was itself an act of cowardice. Instead, they were forced to maintain composure while their world collapsed around them, any sign of emotion punished as weakness. The physical markers of shame were particularly cruel. These women were required to wear specific garments that immediately identified their status to anyone who saw them. Unlike the dignified black robes of honored widows, they wore rough, undyed cloth that resembled the garments of slaves more than free women. Some accounts describe them being forced to wear their hair in a specific style, unkempt and loose, a sign of disgrace in a society where women's appearance was strictly regulated. The temporal restrictions placed on these women created a form of social prison. They were banned from appearing in public during certain hours, typically the busiest times when the agora was full of citizens conducting business. When they were permitted out, they had to take specific routes through the city, avoiding main thoroughfares and places of honor. They couldn't enter certain buildings, couldn't shop at certain stalls, couldn't even draw water from communal wells during peak times. Religious exclusion was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. Spartan women played crucial roles in many religious ceremonies, particularly those honoring Artemis Orthia and other deities associated with fertility and warfare. The wives of defeated warriors were barred from these sacred duties. They couldn't participate in the Hyacinthia, couldn't join the processions during the Carneia, couldn't even make private offerings at household shrines without permission. In a society where religious participation was synonymous with citizenship, this exclusion was tantamount to spiritual death. The systematic nature of these humiliations extended to their children as well. Sons of cowards faced their own torments in the agoj, marked out for special abuse by their trainers and peers. Daughters found themselves unmarriageable, tainted by their father's shame in a society where marriage was the only respectable path for women. The entire family became a cautionary tale, their suffering a teaching tool for Spartan youth about the consequences of failure. Historical records describe specific instances that illuminate the depth of this cruelty. During one religious festival, the wives of warriors who had surrendered at Sphacteria were forced to watch while their husbands' names were ceremonially erased from public monuments. They stood in designated areas, separate from other citizens, while the crowd jeered and threw refuse. The message was clear. These women no longer belonged to the body politic of Sparta. Perhaps most disturbing were the cleansing rituals some of these women were forced to undergo. Based on the belief that cowardice was a form of pollution that could contaminate others, they were subjected to purification ceremonies that bordered on torture. These might include prolonged fasting, exposure to the elements, or ritual beatings designed to drive out the weakness that had infected their households. The physical pain was secondary to the psychological message. They were diseased, and only through suffering could they prevent the spread of their contamination. Among the most horrifying aspects of Sparta's treatment of defeated warriors' wives was the systematic manipulation of their marital status, a form of state-sanctioned sexual control that reduced women to breeding stock in service of military ideology. The Spartan state didn't simply abandon these women to their fate. It actively intervened in their most intimate affairs, orchestrating remarriages and relationships that served as both punishment and a twisted form of eugenics. The moment a warrior was confirmed dead or disgraced, his wife entered a bureaucratic process that would determine her future with cold efficiency. The ephors maintained detailed records of all marriages, bloodlines, and property holdings. They would review each case, considering factors such as the woman's age, her fertility, her family connections, and most importantly, whether she had already produced sons for the state. Based on this assessment, her fate would be decided not by her own wishes or needs, but by what the state determined would best serve Spartan military interests. For younger women who were still of childbearing age, forced remarriage was almost inevitable. But these weren't marriages in any meaningful sense. They were breeding arrangements designed to erase the genetic stain of cowardice. The state would select new husbands from among warriors who had proven themselves in battle, men who had earned the right to father the next generation of Spartans. The woman's consent was neither sought nor required. She was simply transferred from one household to another like a piece of military equipment. The selection process for these forced marriages was deliberately humiliating. Women would be paraded before potential husbands, sometimes in groups, while men evaluated them like livestock at market. Their previous status, education, and personal qualities meant nothing. They were reduced to their biological function. Contemporary accounts describe scenes where decorated warriors would openly discuss the women's physical attributes, their likelihood of producing strong sons, and whether the shame of their first marriage could be bred out through superior paternity. These forced unions came with strict conditions that emphasized the woman's degraded status. She entered the new household not as an equal partner, but as a subordinate, often with fewer rights than a first wife would normally enjoy. She couldn't bring property from her previous marriage, couldn't maintain connections with her former husband's family, and in many cases couldn't even keep her own children if they were deemed tainted by their father's cowardice. The psychological torture of these arrangements was profound. Many women were forced to marry men who had fought against their first husbands, sometimes men who might have been directly responsible for their deaths. They had to share beds with warriors who viewed them as conquered prizes rather than wives, who saw their bodies as vessels for creating better Spartans rather than as belonging to individual human beings with their own desires and autonomy. For women past childbearing age, the situation was often even worse. Without value as potential mothers, they occupied a liminal space in Spartan society. Some were forced into arrangements that resembled slavery more than marriage, attached to households as domestic servants, given to warriors as rewards for valor, or distributed among the perioeci, the free, non-citizen inhabitants of Laconia, as a way of removing them from Spartan society proper. The state also experimented with what modern observers might recognize as selective breeding programs. Women from families with strong military traditions who had the misfortune of marrying cowards were sometimes subjected to multiple remarriages, moved from warrior to warrior in an attempt to produce offspring that would restore their bloodline's honor. These women became unwilling participants in a eugenics experiment, their bodies battlegrounds for competing genetic ideologies. Documentation from ancient sources reveals the existence of formal ceremonies around these forced remarriages that added layers of ritual humiliation. The woman would be required to publicly renounce her former husband, declaring him a coward and herself grateful for liberation from his shame. She would undergo purification rituals meant to cleanse her of her association with failure. Only then would she be presented to her new husband, not as a bride, but as a reclaimed resource for the state. The children from these forced unions occupied a strange position in Spartan society. They were simultaneously hoped to be superior warriors who would redeem their mother's shame and suspected of carrying hidden weakness from their mother's first marriage. These children grew up under intense scrutiny, every failure or sign of weakness attributed to their contaminated maternal line, every success claimed as victory for the state's intervention. The economic devastation faced by the wives of defeated Spartan warriors represented a form of financial warfare that the state waged against its own citizens. In a society where wealth and land ownership were intricately tied to military service and honor, these women found themselves suddenly stripped of the economic foundations that had sustained their households, plunging them into a carefully orchestrated poverty designed to serve as both punishment and deterrent. The Spartan land system, unique among Greek city-states, made economic punishment particularly effective. The kleros system theoretically provided each Spartan citizen with an inalienable plot of land worked by helots, ensuring basic sustenance for warrior families. But this system, which appeared egalitarian on its surface, became a weapon against the families of the disgraced. The moment a warrior was declared a coward or deserter, his family's claim to their kleros became tenuous, subject to review and potential redistribution by the state. The process of economic dismantling began immediately. Ephors would dispatch officials to inventory the household's possessions, a humiliating procedure conducted in full view of neighbors. Every item of value was catalogued: bronze vessels, furniture, stored grain, even personal ornaments. The stated purpose was to ensure that state property wasn't being hidden, but the real intent was to demonstrate the family's fall from grace. These inventories often resulted in confiscations, with valuable items seized as compensation for the military failure. The helots who worked the land presented a particular problem. These enslaved peoples, who outnumbered Spartan citizens by a ratio that some historians estimate at 7-to-1, were essential for agricultural production. When a warrior was disgraced, the helots attached to his household might be reassigned, leaving his widow without the labor force necessary to work whatever land she was allowed to retain. Without helots, even keeping a small garden plot became an insurmountable challenge for a woman alone. The loss of income was immediate and catastrophic. The surplus produced by a typical kleros, barley, wine, oil, and other agricultural products, had provided not just sustenance, but tradable commodities. This surplus allowed Spartan families to participate in the limited market economy, acquiring goods they couldn't produce themselves. The wives of defeated warriors found these income streams severed overnight. They couldn't sell at the regular markets, couldn't trade with other citizens, and were often forced to accept whatever prices they could get from those willing to deal with the disgraced. Financial isolation compounded the economic crisis. In Sparta, as in most ancient societies, economic life was built on networks of reciprocal obligation, loans, gifts, and mutual support that bound families together. The wives of cowards found themselves expelled from these networks. Debts owed to them might go unpaid with impunity. Promises of dowries for their daughters would be withdrawn. Even inheritance from their own birth families could be challenged on the grounds that association with cowardice contaminated wealth. The testimony of Xenophon provides glimpses into the desperate measures these women took to survive. Some attempted to practice trades considered beneath Spartan women, weaving for sale, preparing food for others, even manual labor typically reserved for helots. But even these degrading options were limited. The guild-like associations that controlled various trades could refuse membership to the disgraced, and customers might face social consequences for patronizing them. Property rights, already limited for women in ancient Greece, became nearly non-existent for these particular victims. While Spartan women generally enjoyed more property rights than their counterparts in other Greek cities, the wives of cowards found themselves in a legal limbo. They couldn't inherit from their disgraced husbands, couldn't claim dowry returns, and couldn't even maintain control over property they had brought into the marriage. The state positioned itself as the ultimate arbiter of all property claims, and it consistently ruled against the interests of these women. The documentation suggests that some women were reduced to subsistence strategies that barely distinguished them from beggars. They might glean fields after harvest, hoping to gather enough grain to survive. They would gather wild plants from marginal lands, fish in streams others disdained, or perform menial services for the Perioeci communities on the edges of Spartan territory. Each of these activities further marked them as outcasts, their poverty a visible sign of their husband's failure. The intergenerational transfer of poverty became another weapon in Sparta's arsenal. Children of disgraced warriors couldn't inherit what little property their mothers managed to retain. Sons couldn't claim citizenship rights that normally came with land ownership. Daughters couldn't offer dowries to potential husbands. The economic punishment created a hereditary underclass, families trapped in poverty not by economic forces, but by deliberate state policy designed to make military failure so costly that warriors would choose death over disgrace. Perhaps no aspect of Sparta's treatment of defeated warriors' wives was more brutal than the physical violence they endured. Violence that was not only tolerated, but actively encouraged by the state as part of the comprehensive punishment for military failure. These women, already suffering from social ostracism and economic ruin, also faced the constant threat of physical assault from fellow citizens who saw such violence as both their right and their duty to the state. The violence began with sanctioned public punishments that blurred the line between judicial penalty and mob brutality. Women whose husbands had shown cowardice might be subjected to public beatings in the agora, administered not by official executioners, but by ordinary citizens. These weren't formal floggings with regulated limits. They were chaotic scenes where crowds were encouraged to participate, throwing stones, striking with sticks, or simply pushing and shoving the victims as they tried to pass through public spaces. The sexual violence these women faced remains one of the darkest chapters in Spartan history, one that ancient historians often alluded to, but rarely described explicitly. The wives of defeated warriors lost the protection that their status as married women normally provided. They became, in the eyes of many Spartan men, legitimate targets for sexual assault. The logic was perverse, but consistent with Spartan ideology. If their husbands had failed to defend Sparta with their bodies, then these women's bodies became forfeit to those who had succeeded. Victor's privilege, a concept that existed in various forms throughout the ancient world, took on particularly cruel dimensions in Sparta. Warriors returning from successful campaigns might claim access to the wives of those who had failed, not through any legal mechanism, but through social custom that made resistance impossible. These women couldn't appeal to authorities who saw such violations as natural consequences of their husband's cowardice. They couldn't seek protection from male relatives who had distanced themselves to avoid contamination by association. The physical marking of these women represented another form of violence that left permanent scars. Some accounts describe forced brandings or tattoos that marked them as wives of cowards, visible signs that invited further abuse. Haircutting, while symbolic in nature, was performed with deliberate brutality, not the ritual shearing of mourning, but violent, degrading attacks that left women bloodied and permanently marked. These physical alterations served as invitations for ongoing violence, marking women as acceptable targets for anyone who wished to demonstrate their own loyalty to Spartan values. Children witnessed much of this violence, a deliberate strategy to instill fear and obedience in the next generation. Sons saw their mothers beaten and humiliated, learning that this was the fate awaiting those who failed in battle. Daughters learned that their bodies and dignity depended entirely on the military success of men they hadn't even met yet. The psychological damage to these children, forced to watch their mother's brutalization while being powerless to intervene, created generational trauma that perpetuated Sparta's culture of violence. The religious sanction for violence added another layer of horror. Certain religious festivals included rituals where the wives of cowards were subjected to ceremonial violence, framed as offerings to the gods or purification rites for the community. During the festival of Artemis Orthia, young Spartan men would compete in endurance contests that sometimes involved inflicting pain on these women, who were forced to stand as living targets for demonstrations of warrior prowess. The gods themselves were invoked as demanding this suffering, making resistance not just futile, but sacrilegious. Documentation from archaeological findings suggests that many of these women bore evidence of repeated trauma: broken bones that had healed poorly, skull fractures consistent with repeated beatings, and other injuries that spoke to lives of constant violence. Their remains, when found, were often in irregular burial sites, suggesting that even in death they were denied the dignity of proper funeral rites. The violence followed them to the grave, their bodies disposed of rather than buried, their names erased from family monuments. The complicity of Spartan women in this violence presents a particularly troubling aspect of these practices. Mothers who had successfully raised warrior sons, wives of successful soldiers, and young women seeking to demonstrate their own commitment to Spartan values participated in the abuse of their less fortunate sisters. They threw stones, hurled insults, and physically assaulted women who might have been their friends, relatives, or neighbors before disgrace struck. This female-on-female violence, encouraged by the state, destroyed any possibility of solidarity or mutual support among women facing oppression. The normalization of violence against these women extended to casual, everyday brutality that didn't even register as noteworthy to contemporary observers. Being pushed into gutters, having market goods destroyed, being struck by passing citizens, these became such routine experiences that they rarely merited mention in historical accounts except as passing details. The violence was so pervasive, so accepted, that it became invisible, just another part of the landscape of Spartan life. The innocent victims who suffered most profoundly from Sparta's treatment of defeated warriors' families were the children. Boys and girls who bore no responsibility for their father's actions, yet found themselves condemned to lives of systematic abuse, discrimination, and psychological torture that would shape not only their own futures, but the very fabric of Spartan society for generations to come. From the moment news of their father's cowardice or defeat reached Sparta, these children were transformed from promising young citizens into pariahs marked for life. The sins of the father were visited upon the children with a vengeance that defied any notion of individual justice or mercy. In the Agog, where Spartan boys were trained from age 7 to become warriors, the sons of cowards faced a special kind of hell designed to either break them completely or forge them into warriors who would die rather than repeat their father's shame. The systematic abuse began with isolation, while other boys formed the bonds of brotherhood that would sustain them through battles to come. The sons of defeated warriors were deliberately kept apart. They ate alone or at separate tables, slept in the worst quarters, and were excluded from team exercises that built unit cohesion. This isolation wasn't merely social, it was strategic, designed to prevent the contamination of cowardice from spreading to other future warriors. Physical abuse against these boys exceeded even the notorious harshness of regular Agog training. While all Spartan boys faced beatings, deprivation, and brutal physical challenges, the sons of cowards endured special torments. They were selected for the most dangerous tasks, given the least food, and subjected to beatings not for any infractions, but simply as reminders of their inherited shame. Instructors would publicly humiliate them, forcing them to recite their father's failures before the other boys, to denounce their own bloodline, to beg for the chance to prove they were different. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more damaging than the physical abuse. These boys were constantly reminded that they carried bad blood, that cowardice was in their nature, that they would likely fail just as their fathers had. Every mistake, however minor, was attributed to their inherited weakness. Every success was dismissed as a fluke or treated with suspicion. They lived under constant scrutiny, knowing that the slightest sign of fear or hesitation would confirm everyone's worst assumptions about them. For daughters, the situation was differently cruel, but equally devastating. Spartan girls, who normally enjoyed more freedom and education than their counterparts in other Greek cities, found themselves excluded from the physical training and social activities that prepared young women for their roles as mothers of warriors. They were barred from religious dances, athletic competitions, and the social gatherings where young Spartans typically formed the connections that would lead to marriage. The marriage prospects for these girls were essentially non-existent within normal Spartan society. No self-respecting warrior would risk contaminating his bloodline by marrying the daughter of a coward. These girls faced futures as perpetual spinsters in a society where a woman's value was largely determined by her ability to produce warrior sons. Some were forced into arrangements that resembled slavery more than marriage, given to perioeci or even helots, or exported to other cities as a way of removing the stain of their presence from Sparta itself. The educational discrimination faced by these children extended beyond formal instruction. While Spartan education emphasized poetry, music, and rhetoric alongside military training, the children of defeated warriors were often denied access to these cultural elements. They couldn't participate in choral performances, couldn't recite at religious festivals, couldn't learn the songs and stories that bound Spartan society together. They were raised as cultural orphans, denied not just their father's legacy, but their entire cultural inheritance. Some of the most heartbreaking accounts describe the impossible positions these children were placed in. Sons were sometimes forced to publicly compete against each other for the privilege of being allowed to attempt to restore their family's honor through military service. They had to demonstrate excessive brutality, extraordinary endurance, and complete rejection of their father's memory just for the chance to be allowed to die for Sparta. Many broke under the pressure, fulfilling the prophecy of inherited cowardice through suicide or flight, thereby confirming Spartan prejudices about contaminated bloodlines. The long-term psychological effects on these children were catastrophic. Those who survived to adulthood carried deep trauma that manifested in various ways: excessive aggression as they tried to prove their worth, complete submission to authority as they sought acceptance, or profound depression as they internalized the shame they had been forced to bear. The suicide rate among children of defeated warriors, while not precisely documented, was noted by several ancient sources as remarkably high. The rare success stories, sons of cowards who managed to distinguish themselves in battle, became propaganda tools for the Spartan state. These exceptions were held up as proof that the system worked, that sufficient pressure could overcome even inherited weakness. But for every celebrated redemption, hundreds of children were crushed by a system that denied them any real chance at a normal life. Their suffering was seen not as injustice, but as necessary sacrifice for the maintenance of Spartan military supremacy. While the dominant historical narrative of ancient Sparta was written by and about its warriors, fragments of evidence survive that allow us to glimpse the experiences of the women who suffered under its cruel system. These voices from the shadows, preserved in legal documents, gravestone inscriptions, and the account